But reconciliation as political pietism and aided by Christian quietism is exactly the problem that South Africans are facing right now and are rising up against even as we speak today. In the TRC process, blacks, the victims of apartheid, have offered political, personal, and communal forgiveness on the basis of the Christian gospel and of Ubuntu, a philosophy of life at whose center is the search for and the restoration of harmonious human relationships. They were asked again and again, in the words of Archbishop Tutu, to go, quote, beyond retributive justice to restorative justice, to move on to forgiveness, because without it there really was no future, end quote. But in all of this, there was no reciprocity or equality, which could only take the form of social justice. There was no restitution. There was no restoration of dignity and of community. Moreover, in South Africa, power has changed hands, but there was no genuine realignment of power. No use of that power for the sake of justice, equality, and dignity. And that, in my view, is the great deceit, the incomprehensible betrayal of black people, of their trust in the reconciliation process, and perhaps even of their faith. In an enlightening discussion of journalist and political economist Christies van der Westhuizen's 2007 book, White Power and the Rise and Fall of the National Party, South African economist Sampie Terreblanche, in a paper tellingly titled From White Power to White Wealth, the Unresolved Moral Crisis of White South Africans, spells out in chilling detail the historic injustices that should have been addressed in order to make reconciliation just, humane, and sustainable. Terreblanche, as can be seen from the title of his paper, does not only see the history of inequality and injustice in South Africa as a political or an economic problem applicable to all South Africans. For him, it represents especially a moral crisis for white South Africans. In her impressive book, van der Westhuizen refers to two elite pacts that have dominated South Africa's political and economic history. The first pact lasted from 1909 to 1994. The second pact started in 1994. Justified by different permutations of three ideological positions, namely social Darwinism, civilization, and religion, whites used their monopoly of power to perpetuate the elite pact of 1909 until 1994. Whites now, Terreblanche writes, used this power to, quote, enrich the whites undeservedly and to impoverish the blacks undeservedly. Note three key concepts that Terreblanche deliberately employs: enrichment, impoverishment, and undeserved. Thus, from the start, we are disabused of the myths of domination, disabused of romantic notions about poverty, as if it was the natural, God-given state of black people, enrichment as if wealth was a blessing from God, especially to whites, or the just reward for their hard work and industry. It is about processes of impoverishment and wealth creation, and the fact that both these conditions were undeserved. Both impoverishment and enrichment are interdependent, active, continuing, and deeply systemic processes based on and bolstered by deliberate policies designed to create victims and beneficiaries. Terreblanche then proceeds to lay bare the systemic nature of this undeserved wealth and undeserved impoverishment. During the first 3/4 of the 20th century, he writes, whites were always less than 22% of the total population, but consistently received more than 70% of the total income. Africans were almost 70% of the population and consistently received less than 20% of the total income. Let us not try to diminish the extent of the whites' undeserved enrichment or the blacks' undeserved impoverishment, Terre Blanche cautions us. Both were very great, bringing with them very high levels of racial inequality and racial hostility. Whites were getting richer, while blacks were, quote, already drawn into a pauperization process that was perpetuating itself, end quote. The second elite pact of 1994, after the negotiated settlement at Kempton Park, and which gave rise to our reconciliation process, took effect under the tutelage of the United States and the Bretton Woods institutions, instituting a new power constellation and a new political economic system. The point that Terre Blanche makes is that, quote, the poverty of the poorest half of the population represents a situation of multiple deprivations. It is as if the ANC government, he says, does not understand the strong dynamism of pauperization that perpetuates and intensifies itself from one generation to the following, especially in a system of neoliberal global capitalism. The vicious circle has now become a downward spiral. The contradictions caused by these realities are sobering. I quote him again. We are faced with a contradictory situation that at least 80% of the whites who were already rich in 1994 thanks to apartheid are now much richer, while 60% of the blacks who were already poor in 1994 as a direct result of apartheid are now much poorer. Then Terre Blanche asked the moral question, what are we doing in this country? This was 2007. As a white person, Terre Blanche then has a final word for whites. He says, we have proceeded from white power to white wealth, but we should realize that our moral crisis is far from being resolved. On the contrary, it is as grave as ever. Now, in light of this, calling for reconciliation as the restoration of justice, rights, dignity, and community is not setting the bar too high, nor is it chasing rainbows, I argue.